Hello and welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I am Tony,
I'm Patrick.
and we are working our way through the book, The Great Debate, Does God Exist? It's a reading and analysis of the Bahnsen Stein debate, and it was put together by Joshua Pillows, and he also has commentary with regard to this. And so we finished the first chapter where we had Greg Bahnsen give his opening statement, and now we're going through Dr. Stein's opening statement. And we've finished in our last video the first three arguments of his 11 that he gives against, the existence of God. Now, what he suggests here is that he's not arguing that God does not exist. He's saying he's trying to show that these arguments do not show that God exists. And so he believes that if he can defeat these 11 arguments, then he's won the debate and shown that God doesn't exist, right? So there it is. Now, we pointed out several different ways in our last video that, as Bahnsen suggested, Bahnsen is defending the Christian God. And of course, Stein doesn't want to be that specific. So he kind of gives, as Patrick mentioned, a generic kind of view of God. And that's the God that he's attacking. And again, that, I'm not sure about how that fares with regard to straw man types of arguments, but there we have it, right? So he's working his way through these 11 arguments, and we've worked our way to number 4. So let's start there, and we'll see if we can get through the rest of these during this time. So the fourth argument is the argument from revealed theology. The argument from revealed theology. He says, then we have the argument from revealed theology, which seems to be one of Dr. Bahnsen's favorites. So he thinks this is Bahnsen's argument, right?
He must have thumbed through just the catalog and
Right.
put his finger on it. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
the Bible, gotcha.
Yeah, the Bible, that's right. And so it says that the Bible says that God does exist, and the Bible is the inspired word of God. Therefore, what it says must be true, and therefore God exists. Boom. QED, right? That is the argument for revealed theology. He says, well, this is obviously a circular argument. It begs the question, he tells us. We're trying to show whether God exists, and therefore calling the Bible the Word of God is not permitted because it assumes the existence of the very thing that we're trying to prove. And so, slam, bam, thank you, ma'am. This is not a good argument, right?
Yeah, put a finger on this argument because it shows its head a couple more times that you wouldn't have expected it to show up. All right, well, as we mentioned, that this book is being edited and commentated on from time to time by Joshua Pills, and then depending on how you get the book, they're kind of there at the bottom making these comments. So he says, what are two crucial points in Bahnsen's opening statement? So Pills is asking us to think back to exactly what Bahnsen was arguing for, and it couldn't have been that Stein, if he would have listened to some of his previous debates or writings, would be caught by surprise by this. So Pills is saying, what were the two crucial points of Bahnsen's opening statement? The first one is there's no such thing as being neutral and unbiased at the outset. So this isn't shocking to us. How dare you believe the biblical Christian God exists? You can't believe that at first. You have to prove that he exists first. But I do believe he exists first. So I'm not going to put it aside to then argue back to it because that's not my position.
Yeah, and by the way, again, Bahnsen makes the point, nobody is neutral.
Right,
Everybody comes into it with presuppositions. That's the main point that he's trying to get at. And what you have to do is look at their presuppositions, their worldviews, and that's what you attempt to show whether or not they're rational, right? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily individual arguments. So the Christian is not neutral, Bahnsen said, but neither is the unbeliever is neutral. We're all biased, and so we have to recognize that, and we have to then take that into account in our argumentation.
Right. There's no tabula rasa. There's no, let me forget about everything that I've learned about and then come at something. Well, if you've wiped your mind of everything, there's nothing there to figure out the difference between anything or the definition of things. So, good job. The second one is that therefore everyone begs the question in terms of assuming certain beliefs at the outset of the argument. Things like the laws of logic. I'm able to reason, right? How do I know I'm able to reason? Well, because I'm reasoning. Well, you can't use that because that's the circular argument in the question. So,
yeah.
Well, I'll give you another reason. Whoa. Stop begging the question here. Well, how about we test to see if this is true, and if it comes out based on my my assumed reason, then we know that my reason's accurate. Well, isn't reasoning to the experiment and then saying that the experiment reflects your reason, isn't that also reason? So again, we're caught in this loop of begging the question and talking about our ultimate belief systems and whether or not it's correct to have fallacious begging the question versus necessary begging the questions.
This versus virtuous
right.
begging the question.
To presuppositionally hold, this is again, pillows again, to presuppositionally hold to certain beliefs at the outset of argumentation, like a Christian believing the Bible is true, an atheist believing the Bible is not true, right? Those are two beliefs on the outset. It is not inherently fallacious, as these are simply assumptions. They're not arguments.
And so I think this is kind of an interesting point, right? You can have a fallacy with an argument, right? But an assumption, he's suggesting, is not an argument. So you really can't label it as a fallacy, right? It's just an assumption. And so anyway, we can, folks can think about that a little bit more, but I thought that was kind of an interesting kind of take on this kind of thing.
Sure.
All right, number 5, right? The argument from miracles, Stein tells us, right? He says, then we have the argument from miracles. It says that the existence of miracles requires the presence of a supernatural force, that is, a God. Miracles do occur, and therefore there is a supernatural force or God. So there's the argument, right? And he tells us again, this is begging the question. Right? Now, everything sounds like begging the question to him. Of course,
it's almost like all arguments are begging the question.
Are begging the question, right? And of course, this is the very point that, Bahnsen is going to make. He's going to zing him about this begging the question stuff. Yeah. As you mentioned, with regard to laws of logic later on in the debate. But anyway, again, this is begging the question, this miracles argument, right? It requires that you must believe in the existence of a God first, beforehand, and then you say that there are such things as miracles, which are the acting of a God to create violations of his own laws. So he tells us it's not evidence per se, right? That is the argument from miracles isn't evidence per se, he tells us, but it can serve as supplementary once we have good evidence in another kind of way for the existence of a God. Then we can use miracles, he tells us, as an additional argument. But in and of itself, it doesn't show the existence of a God because it assumes that which is to be proven. So there, we have another question-begging argument.
Right. Yes, in more ways than one, we have question begging there. Pillows goes on to comment here from Bahnsen's opening statement. He says, in advance, you see Dr. Stein is committed to disallowing any theistic interpretation of nature, history, or experience due to his naturalism, right? Well, this is something we talked about with our scientism in our previous book with J.P. Moreland of, if you definition away, and then if you keep out any alternate explanations or worldviews,
no intelligence allowed.
Right, exactly. Then you're going to look around and go, we're all homogenous here. It seems like we all don't have a belief in the supernatural, therefore the supernatural doesn't exist. Meanwhile, the theists are pounding at the door trying to get back into the buildings that they once created. So that seems to be an issue here. Pills goes on to say that what he seems to overlook, that is Stein, is that this is just as much begging the question on his own part as it is on part of the theist who appeals to such evidence. He is not at all proven by empirical observation and logic his pre-commitment to naturalism. He has assumed it in advance, accepting and rejecting all further factual claims in terms of that controlling an unproven assumption. So you watch the resurrection happen 100%. You say, yep, that was Jesus before he died, he rose again. But that just you can't use that as a proof for the supernatural, because you have to prove God exists, and then you can say God did the resurrection. But this just seems to be a weird happenstance, a weird coincidence, and I'm not obligated to interact with your supernatural claims here, even though I'll see the entire events of the resurrection.
So one of the things that Pillows is drawing from is not just the debate content, but also after the debate, there was a series of letters back and forth between Bahnsen and Stein. And so Pillows is also drawing from some of that material. For instance, with regard to this, he says this, let me just read this, is on page 27. This is apparently a letter that Bahnsen got from Stein. He says, to allege, this is Bahnsen speaking, to allege, as does your August 10th letter, that it is impossible to have satisfactory documentation for a miraculous event is an attempt to win an argument in a completely a priori fashion, superstitiously ruling out from the outset anything that you don't want to find.
Right.
So he nails him on his assumption with regard to naturalism there, which is the point that I think Pillows is making here. All right.
Yep.
All right, let's look at Stein's sixth argument, right, for the generalized, generic God, right? The ontological argument. He says, then we come to the ontological argument, one of the most difficult ones to explain to people. But basically it says God is by definition perfect. A necessary quality of any perfect object is that it exists. If it did not exist, it would not be perfect. If perfection requires existence, then God exists since God is perfect. So there it is, right? Ontological argument. This one there's various versions, by the way, of all of these arguments. He chooses the particular one that he wants to criticize. But again, he talks about 11 arguments, but there's multiple versions of the ontological and the cosmological argument, by the way.
Sure.
So there are multiple versions of these. There's multiple versions of the design or teleological argument, but he kind of frames them in terms of what he wants to deal with. All right, so what's the problem here with the ontological argument? This one based on the perfection, right? If something is perfect, it has to exist. God is perfect, so he has to exist. That's the basic idea. Well, it says in order for something to be perfect, it must first exist, right? And if something did not exist, then the word perfect wouldn't mean anything. So first you must have existence, and then possibly you may have perfection. And so he says, again, this is going backwards. We must have an existing God, then we can decide whether he's perfect. If perfectness is a quality of a God, then he may be perfect, but he first must exist. So that's kind of his slam on this particular version of the ontological argument.
Yeah. This is Anselm rolling around in his grave, attempting to get out. Well, Pillows comments that Van Til and Bahnsen likewise oppose the traditional ontological argument, and he said that we should be careful, so this is Bahnsen speaking, we should be careful when we say that God is the being than whom none higher can be thought. If we take the highest being of what we can think, in that sense, or in the sense of to have a concept of, and the attribute to it actual existence, we do not have the biblical notion of God. And so this is kind of a general theism claim here, and we lose certain aspects of the biblical God, which you're going to need further down the path. So you might get, again, the Faith Has Its Reasons book. We talked about this kind of two-step approach, is that you provide kind of the general qualifications for a God, a deity who is kind of singular, and you kind of mold him into a certain fashion that, through a lens darkly might appear to be a biblical Christian God, but then you develop the fact that it's got to be the biblical Christian God with your evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. So that's not the path that Van Til and presuppositionalists want to go down because of the issues involved with that as well.
All right, so that was number 6. Now number 7, the moral argument. He says, then we have the moral argument. All people have moral values. The existence of these values cannot be explained unless they were implanted, he tells us, in people by a God, and therefore God exists. Right? These values were implanted into me by God. That sounds awesome, ominous. He says, well, the answer to this is that there are simpler ways to explain the origin of moral values without requiring the existence of a God to implant them in people. He says, besides, so first, there's a better way to explain, right? And so that's the first knock on this one, he suggests. And then he says, besides, if moral values did come from a God, then all people should have the same moral values, and they don't. All right. So different people have different moral values, and therefore, if they all came from God, then everybody would have the same ones. That's his basic idea. He says people's moral values, notice, and now here's the source of it from his perspective. People's moral values are the result of an accommodation which they have made with their particular environment and then taught to their children as a survival mechanism. So where does the moral values come from, according to Stein? Well, we accommodate our environment, right? And then we teach that accommodation to our children so that they can survive in that environment. So there it is. It's just a matter of survival value. That's why
Right.
the morals that we have, right?
Yes, including loving that child to teach them your values.
Yeah.
It's a survival mechanism. All right, you got to live so that my DNA can further be spread. So
That's right.
that's what
And
we're
it's a kind of, kind of a version of the evolutionary account of morality,
right.
right?
Yep. Number 8 for him is the wish argument. Okay, then we have the wish argument, he says. Without the existence of a God, people would have no reason to live or be good. Therefore, there has to be a God. Most people don't believe in God. Therefore, most people believe in a God. Therefore, there is a God. Well, this isn't really a proof. It's just a wish. It's like saying it would be nice to have a God, which it would. Probably wouldn't really admit that.
Yeah,
But
really.
that doesn't have anything to do with whether there is one or not. So this is just a wish, and it would be good for God to exist, and since most people believe it, we should kind of rule by majority value. But this seems to be more of a control aspect to humanity than a truth aspect.
All right. And so Pillows doesn't really deal with this one at all.
Yeah.
He kind of lets this one go by. He, allows Stein to have his wish. So, number 8, the argument from faith. He says, we have the argument from faith. The existence of a God cannot be proven by the use of reason, but only by the use of faith. The use of faith shows that there is a God, therefore God exists. Well, of course, he has a problem with this one, right? He says reason or logic is a proven way of obtaining factual information about the universe. Faith has never been shown to produce true information about the universe because faith is believing something is so because you want it to be so without adequate evidence, right? Believing something is so because you want it to be so. This sounds like his wish argument, right?
Yeah.
Without adequate evidence. Therefore, it cannot be used to prove the existence of anything. Faith can't be used to prove the existence of anything because it's just believing something is so because you want it to be so without any adequate evidence. If you had adequate evidence, he's suggesting here it wouldn't be faith. It'd be something else. So.
Well, and Pills is going to take him to task here, so he may have let the wish one go by, but he held the swing for faith. And so Pills comments here by saying that all reasoning rests on faith. All reasoning rests on it. Foundationally, faith is the legitimacy of one's reasoning ability. Dr. Stein assumes as much. Reason or logic is a proven way of obtaining factual information about the universe, he said. Well, Dr. Stein is saying this, possesses faith in his presumed rationality, whether he sees it or not, or whether he likes it or not. I'm going to assume that if I apply my reason to something I haven't encountered before, something on the other side of Jupiter I've never seen before, something in the Andromeda galaxy that caused me to question the nature of reality, I'm able to reason from it. Whoa, where's your data for this? Where's your scientific proof for this? Where's your understanding? And we'll get into his understanding of what laws of logic and reason are in the back and forth. But this seems to have that smell of faith in it, a trust in something outside of oneself that is reliable, and so that seems to be what's happening here.
Yeah, this is kind of, I think C.S. Lewis talked about this. In fact, many people claim that Darwin himself talked about this, right? How can we trust our reasoning if it's indeed just came about through chance kind of thing, right?
Sure.
That's the basic idea. But we do trust it, right? Why do we trust it? Well, trust is a matter of faith, right? Now we might say, well, in the past, it's shown to be true. Okay, well, that was the past. How do you know it's going to be true next time? Now you're into the problem of induction, right? But anyway, so that's kind of what they're looking at here. Stein have to have faith in his reasoning, and that is a faith commitment. So everybody uses faith with regard to their various basic assumptions and presuppositions. And again, we're going to see this point made over and over and over again, right? There's no neutrality. We all have assumptions and presuppositions.
And then Pills goes on to say that not only is Dr. Stein confusing faith with fideism, blind faith with no evidence, but assuming he realizes that too, possesses faith, he must either admit that he has no adequate evidence for the legitimacy of his reasoning abilities, and thus refutes himself in the process of attempting to be rational, or he must alter his position to avoid self-refutation. Again, that comes back to that. And to get a take of what fideism actually looks like, Faith Has Its Reasons book, caveofthecross.com. We cover that extensively.
All right, good. Number 10. So we have one more after this, so hang with us here. Number 10, the argument from religious experience. He says, now the argument from religious experience, many people have claimed to have had a personal experience or encounter with God, and therefore he must exist. Well, he doesn't like this one either, right? But the feeling of having met God must not be confused with the fact of having met him. So he distinguishes between feelings and fact, right? He says this is a confusion, semantic confusion, right? Semantics has to do with meaning of words and stuff. And also, we cannot use our own feelings as if they were valid information about the world. They are feelings that we have inside of us, but you cannot demonstrate them to another person. They cannot be used as evidence. So there it is. You can't use religious experience because it's just a feeling. Right.
There was a bank robbery, and as I was with some friends out back in the alley going to lunch, I ran into a masked person who said, "Out of the way, I just robbed the bank. I have to get out of here."
And he points a gun at you.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to tell the cops that, and they're going to go, "Listen, we don't know that. You can't use your own experience for that. You might feel like you've encountered the bank robber, but we're not going to take you seriously. So you can't prove that you ran into the bank robber, so get out of here. We're not going to talk to you." That's exactly
just a feeling.
That's how people. That's definitely how people use it. Again, like you could critique these 11 different arguments. There are critiques for it, and some we'd be happy to even bolster and agree with. But these are just lazy ways of finding the lowest common factor and then attacking it. So it's just poor here.
And Bahnsen would say, according to Pillows here, Bahnsen would agree that given the obvious point that the presuppositions rejects the historic theistic proofs, right, let alone internal reference points. So Bahnsen would suggest, yeah, I agree. You can't trust, this kind of argumentation. But Bahnsen would also agree that, the presuppositionalist rejects all of these theistic historic proofs. And so, yes, good for you, Stein.
Yeah, we agree, but completely different
That's
levels.
right, yeah.
Well, and then the 11th one is our good friend Pascal. And just go to YouTube and in the magnifying glass on the Cave of the Cross page, if you type in Pascal's wager, we've done a number of videos on it and you can find them as well. But Dr. Stein has an issue with Pascal's wager. He gives it here and he says that Pascal's wager is the last of the 11 arguments. I hear this a lot on the campuses. It says that since we don't know whether God exists or not, we have no way of finding out in this life. We have nothing to lose by believing in a God. On the other hand, you have a lot to lose if you do not believe in a God, and there later turns out to be one after we're dead. Those are the two strands. So either God exists or he doesn't exist. If he doesn't exist, then whether or not you believe in him has no bearing, and you're just worm food at the end of life anyways, and it doesn't really matter. But if he does exist, then it's better for you to bet that he does exist because the ramifications of it are poor against you if you are rejecting it. But again, I guess it depends on which version of God you're believing in, and so Dr. Stein could probably just hand wave this way very easily.
And that's what he does.
What God?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what he does.
And in fact, that's exactly what he does. So he says, well, if this one's true, then number one, you are right about a God, and secondly, you have to have picked the right religion. So you have to be right about God in general, and then you have to have picked the right God to believe in as well, the right religion. Because you might wind up on Judgment Day and be right about God, but pick the wrong religion.
And then down you go, he tells us.
That's right. Pill's comment here before we end is, from a biblical perspective, Pascal's wager is erroneous wager altogether and should be rejected. And why is that? Well, because Bahnsen is a biblical Christian who wants to wave his Bible and say, this is the God that I believe in, then Romans 1 and Psalm 19 tells us that all people know the triune God exists. And so, again, this is why we can't put down the Bibles.
The truth, right?
So in order to suppress it, you have to have contact in some fashion. So there's still that contact to suppress it. So, if this version of God doesn't exist, then, that's neither here nor there. But if this God does exist and the person holding to it that you're talking to has these presuppositions in mind, then that's the version that is going to be argued. And of course, because why pick a position that you don't really hold to? Pick a position that you do hold to and then argue for that. That's the whole point of the debate. And so Bahnsen's also going to agree with me that that's the whole point of the debate. All right. Well,
that does it.
That is it for Dr. Stein's opening statement. So probably a traditional understanding of does God exist debate, that's probably a boilerplate argumentation for him. He probably has done that presentation a number of times. He's probably used different jokes from time to time, but for the most part, that's probably is his main arguments that he's going to open with. And so Bahnsen has seemed to have left too much on the table to make up for it. And so we're going to see what happens when Bahnsen has his rebuttal for next time. And so, of course, you can still pick up the book and be right with us. The benefits of the book is that you have a one place in book form spot for all the for the transcript portion. You have Joshua Pill's commentary here, and you have access to some of the appendices that we'll probably get to later. And also, like Tony was saying, there were conversations through letters between Bahnsen and Stein after this debate that Bill is sometimes referencing throughout the debate here to give us some more insight into what's being said and what could have also been said as well.
By the way, the rebuttals here are just a series of questions. So They don't really attack necessarily the person's argument, at least in this first series of rebuttals. They give a series of, I think Bahnsen gives a series of like 5 questions, and then Stein gives a series of 5 questions. I think that's the rebuttal method they're going to use here.
Right. So yeah, this type of debate is a different than what we see kind of online as the normal kind of traditional. I don't even know if it's traditional. It's the more commonplace form of debate and what we have. So yeah. So again, all the links to the book are below, and to a video rendition of the debate with the transcript, and also the Bahnsen Institute, where you can find all Greg Bahnsen's recorded bits and pieces as well. So join us next time as we continue on and figure out what makes this debate so great, and hopefully you'll join us with the book in hand. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.